You can't even afford to fix your son's shoes." Claire slid the divorce papers across the dinner table, her voice flat and cold. The crisp, white envelope skidded to a stop beside Julian's untouched plate. In the living room, 8-year-old Mason sat frozen on the couch, his small hands gripping a worn sneaker with a split sole, listening to every word. Julian said nothing. He only looked down at his calloused hands, the hands of a delivery driver, a man with no money, no status, no future in the city of Cleveland. That night, Claire walked out on the arm of a wealthy investor named Trevor Hayes. She never saw the phone light up in Julian's pocket. A single call, a number from New York. By sunrise, everything would change. The apartment on Delmore Street smelled of motor oil and instant coffee, and Julian Brooks had long stopped noticing either. He moved through the narrow kitchen, the way a man moves through a place he has memorized in the dark, pouring cereal into a chipped blue bowl, smoothing down the cowlick that rose every morning from the back of Mason's head. The boy ate with his elbows on the table, swinging his legs beneath the chair, and Julian watched him with total, unbroken attention. It was the shoes that started it. Or rather, the shoes were the thing Claire pointed to, though everyone in that small apartment understood. The shoes were never really the point. Mason's sneakers had split along the left sole 3 weeks earlier. Julian had patched them twice with rubber cement and a strip of electrical tape, and twice the repair had held for a few days before peeling loose again. That morning, the boy had walked to the bus stop with a faint slap. Slap following each step, and a girl in his class had laughed, and Mason had come home quiet in the particular way that told Julian something had been bruised that no bandage could reach. Julian had knelt on the kitchen floor that evening, the sneaker in his hands, turning it patiently, looking for the seam where it had failed. He had the hands of a man who fixed things. Broad knuckles, a thin white scar across one thumb, fingernails that never quite came clean no matter how hard he scrubbed. He told Mason he would have them good as new by the weekend. He meant it. That was the moment Claire walked in. She stood in the doorway in her tailored gray coat. Her hair pulled back a leather portfolio under her arm, and she looked at her husband, kneeling on the linoleum with a broken child's shoe in his hands, and something in her face closed like a door. "We need to talk," she said, not in front of him. But she said the rest of it in front of him anyway. They sat at the dinner table, the same table where Julian had helped Mason with his multiplication that afternoon, and Claire set down a single white envelope and slid it across the surface until it stopped against his plate. "I've already signed," she said. "I had it drawn up last week." Julian did not reach for the envelope. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at her, and his voice when it came was low and even. "Last week. You can't even afford to fix your son's shoes." The words landed flat and final. "Do you understand? That 8 years old. And I'm the one buying him new ones because his father patches the old ones with tape." In the living room, Mason had gone very still on the couch, the broken sneaker clutched against his chest, and Julian saw him there and saw that the boy had heard and felt something tighten beneath his ribs that he kept entirely off his face. "Keep your voice down," Julian said. "Why, so he doesn't find out the truth he already knows, Julian. Kids always know." Claire's hands trembled, though whether from anger or something more complicated, even she could not have said. "I am 33 years old. I have given 7 years to this apartment that smells like a garage, to a man who drives other people's packages around the city for a living. I used to think it was temporary. I kept waiting for the part where things got better. And they didn't get better. You didn't even try to make them better." She said it like an accusation she had rehearsed. "That's the part I can't forgive. Other men want more. Other men claw their way up. You smile and you fix the toaster and you act like none of it matters." Julian's eyes moved almost involuntarily toward the door that led to the garage off the back of the apartment. It was an old reflex, and he caught it and brought his gaze back before she noticed. Behind that door, bolted to the concrete floor beneath a tarp, and a stack of broken radios, was a steel safe that Mason had been told never to touch. Julian had told the boy it held important papers. That was true as far as it went. "None of it matters the way you think it matters," Julian said quietly. Claire laughed a short, brittle sound. "That. Right there. That's exactly what I mean. You talk in riddles, and you live like this, and you expect me to call it wisdom." He did not answer. He had learned over the years that there were things a man could not explain to a person who had already decided not to listen. And there were things he had promised himself he would never explain to anyone again, for reasons that lived in a hospital corridor 8 years in the past, in a name he no longer said out loud. So he let her talk. He let the silence after her words do the work that argument never could. It was the wrong response. It was always the wrong response with Claire. His calm read to her as indifference, and his patience read as weakness, and the more steadily he met her storms, the more she felt she was screaming into a well. "There's someone else," she said finally. Her chin lifted as she said it, defiant, expecting him to break. "I want you to hear it from me. His name is Trevor. Trevor Hayes. He builds things, Julian. Real estate development funds. He is going to do enormous things. And he looks at me like I matter, like I'm going somewhere. And I am going somewhere. With him." Julian had known the name before she said it. Trevor Hayes had been circling Claire's company for months, a man who wore his ambition like cologne, the sort of investor who shook your hand while already calculating what you were worth to him. Julian had seen his type 1,000 times in another life. He had been in rooms with men far more dangerous than Trevor Hayes, and walked out owning the building. But he said none of that. He looked across the table at the woman he had married in a courthouse with $12 in his pocket and a future she could not have imagined, and he felt, beneath the ache, a strange and terrible clarity. "All right," he said. Claire blinked. "All right. That's all you have to say. What would you like me to say?" For just a moment her certainty wavered, as though some part of her had wanted. The fight had wanted him to plead, because pleading would have proved he still loved her, and she could have walked away with that proof in her hands. But he gave her nothing to hold. The days that followed pressed in from every side. On Tuesday, the landlord, a heavy-set man named Walter Pruitt, who owned half the block and treated his tenants like a debt he resented, taped a notice to their door. The rent was 3 weeks late. Julian had the money, or could have had it in 20 minutes with a single phone call, but he counted out what he had in the coffee can above the refrigerator and came up short by $60, and he asked Pruitt for 2 more days. And Pruitt told him that men who couldn't make rent had no business raising a child in an apartment they couldn't pay for. On Wednesday, Julian came down to the street and found his delivery van with 2 slashed tires and a long key gouge raked down the driver's side, the side mirror snapped clean off and lying in the gutter. Nothing had been stolen. That was the detail that stayed with him, turning over in his mind as he crouched beside the ruined tire. Vandals took things. This was a message. Someone wanted him to understand that staying was going to cost more than leaving. He did not yet have a name for the hand behind it. But Julian Brooks had spent his entire adult life reading the difference between chaos and design, and this had the cold fingerprints of design all over it. Mason came down the stairs in his socks, while Julian was sweeping the broken glass into a dustpan. The boy looked at the van and at his father kneeling on the asphalt, and his small face did something complicated. "Was it the bad kids from the corner?" Mason asked. "Maybe. Mom says we're moving." Julian set down the dustpan. "Did she?" "She says we're going to live somewhere nicer, with Trevor." Mason scuffed one taped sneaker against the curb. "I heard her on the phone. She said," he stopped and looked at his shoes, and Julian waited, because he had learned that the boy would find the words if no one rushed him. She said, "You're never going to be somebody." She said, "You're never going to be successful." Something passed across Julian's face, then swift and deep gone almost before it arrived. "Come here," he said. And Mason came and Julian crouched, so they were eye to eye on the broken sidewalk. "Listen to me. There are things people say when they're afraid. Your mother is afraid. People who are afraid sometimes hurt the people closest to them, because those are the only ones standing close enough to reach." He took the boy's chin gently in his oil-stained fingers. "But I need you to remember something. Some things, once they're lost, you can never get them back. Do you understand that?" Mason did not understand it, not fully. He nodded anyway, because his father's voice had gone very quiet and very serious, and because the boy trusted that voice more than anything in the world. Friday. Julian signed the papers. He did it at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning before Mason woke with the same pen he used to sign delivery manifests. He did not read the document. There was nothing in it he needed to see. Claire watched from the doorway in her gray coat, and when he pushed the signed pages back across the table, she gathered them quickly, almost guiltily, the way a person grabs something before it can be taken back. "Trevor's sending a car for me at noon," she said. "I'll come for my things this weekend. Mason will work out Mason." "We'll work out Mason," Julian repeated, and there was something in the flatness of it that made her look up sharply, but his face told her nothing. She lingered at the door. Whatever she had imagined this moment would feel like it was not feeling like that, and the wrongness of it unsettled her more than tears would have. "You're really not going to fight," she said. It was not quite a question. "There are things worth fighting for," Julian said. "And there are people who've already made their choice. You made yours a long time ago, Claire. I just signed the paper that proves it." She left at noon. A black sedan idled at the curb beside his ruined van, and a driver in a dark suit opened the rear door, and Claire Brooks slid into a world of leather and quiet and climate control, and did not look back at the window where her son stood watching. That night, Julian sat alone at the kitchen table after Mason had gone to bed. The apartment was very quiet. The coffee can sat where it always sat. The broken sneaker lay on the counter, where he had finally finished mending it that afternoon, the new soul-holding firm ready for Monday. His phone rang at 11 minutes past 10. He knew the number before he turned it over. A New York exchange, a private line that fewer than a dozen people on Earth possessed. He had not heard it ring in nearly 2 years. He had hoped in some quiet and unrealistic corner of himself that it never would again. He answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was crisp, urgent, and unmistakably afraid, in the controlled way of men who are paid never to sound afraid. It was the chairman of the board of Black Ridge Holdings, and he spoke for 90 seconds without interruption, and Julian listened, his expression unchanging, his eyes on the mended shoe across the room. The Mercer merger, the largest acquisition the firm had ever attempted, $11 billion in motion across 3 continents, was collapsing. The architecture of the entire deal had been Julian's, designed years ago, and left dormant, and now that it was failing, there was exactly one person alive who understood it well enough to save it. The board had voted. They needed him. Not his advice relayed through proxies and anonymous lines, as it had been for 2 years. Him. In the room. Visible. "You understand what we're asking," the chairman said. "You understand what it means. We can't keep you in the dark anymore, Julian. If you do this, then sooner or later, the whole world is going to know exactly who you are. There's no putting that back in the box." Julian was quiet for a long moment. Through the thin wall, he could hear his son's slow, even breathing in the next room. "I understand," he said. He set the phone down on the table. He sat there in the dark a while longer, in the cramped apartment that smelled of motor oil and instant coffee, the apartment a woman had just left because the man who lived in it would never be somebody. Then he rose. crossed to the doorway of Mason's room, and stood, watching the small shape rise and fall beneath the blanket. "Tomorrow," he said softly to the boy to himself, to a city that had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow, everything changes. By the next morning, the financial world had its headline, even if it did not yet have a face to attach to it. A formal valuation filed quietly through Blackridge's attorneys, before dawn, made it official, in the language that such things require, the founder of Blackridge Holdings, still unnamed, still nothing more than a signature, and a fund, was now recognized as the wealthiest man in the state of Ohio. The number ran across the morning programs. Reporters chased the name behind it and hit the same wall they always hit. And on Delmore Street, the richest man in Ohio made cereal. Julian did nothing to suggest the world had shifted beneath him in the night. He smoothed the cowlick. He drove Mason to school in a borrowed truck because the van still sat on its rims at the curb, and he kissed the top of the boy's head and told him to be good. And he watched until the small figure disappeared through the school doors. To anyone who passed him on the sidewalk that morning, he was exactly what he had been the day before, a delivery driver in a worn jacket. A man the city had no reason to notice. That was deliberate. Julian had spent 2 years learning that the most powerful thing a man could do was remain unseen until the precise moment seeing him would cost his enemies everything. He had been named. He had not yet been found. There was a difference, and he intended to choose the hour the difference closed. In the weeks that followed, the world arranged itself into the shape Claire had chosen. She appeared in places she had only read about before. There were photographs, now Claire on Trevor Hayes' arm at a hospital fundraiser, Claire in a column about the city's rising couples, Claire laughing at a rooftop reception with a glass of something pale and expensive in her hand. She had a new address in a glass tower downtown, and a closet that no longer smelled of motor oil, and when she came to collect the last of her things from the apartment, she moved through the small rooms like a woman visiting a country she had emigrated from years ago. Nobody believed Julian could stand against Trevor Hayes. Why would they? Trevor had money, and the particular kind of power that money buys in a mid-sized city. The developers who returned his calls, the council members who took his meetings, the reporters who printed his name with the word visionary attached. He had begun in small and untraceable ways to make Julian's life narrower. A word to Walter Pruitt about the eviction. A quiet suggestion to the temp agency that handled Julian's delivery contracts. Doors that had been merely difficult became all at once locked. Mason felt it sideways and without explanation. A boy named Cooper in his class had started calling him Garbage Kid because Cooper's father had heard from someone that the Brooks family was being put out of their apartment. Mason came home with his knuckles scraped one afternoon and would not say how, and Julian cleaned the cuts at the kitchen sink without lecturing him because Julian understood that there are insults a boy must answer and that the answering is not always wrong. "They said you can't take care of me," Mason said, his voice small over the running water. "They said Mom left because you're poor." Julian dried the boy's hand with a dish towel. What do you think? Mason considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old can bring to a question. "I think you fixed my shoes." "I did fix your shoes." "So they're wrong. Some people," Julian said, "measure a man by what's in his pockets, and some people measure him by what he'd give up everything in his pockets to protect. You'll meet both kinds your whole life, son. Try to be the second kind." Through all of it, the city had developed an obsession. The financial pages had been running the same story for weeks in different shapes. Blackridge Holdings, the secretive investment fund, whose holdings reached into half the major firms in the state, was at the center of the largest merger anyone could remember, and no one knew who ran it. The fund had a chairman, aboard a wall of attorneys, but every thread when pulled led back to a single founder whose name had never once appeared in print. Speculation had become a sport, a reclusive heir, a foreign consortium, a man who did not exist at all invented as a legal fiction. The mystery had grown so large that it had detached from any individual and become a kind of weather the whole city lived under. Claire read these stories the way everyone did, with idle fascination, never once connecting the faceless titan in the headlines to the man who had knelt on her kitchen floor with a broken sneaker in his hands. The night it broke open was the night of the Sterling Gala in Chicago. It was the largest gathering of money in the region, a black tie event, where the men who moved the markets came to be seen moving them, where a single conversation beside the bar could redirect millions. Trevor Hayes had secured a table near the front, and he arrived with Claire on his arm, in a gown the color of deep wine, and for an hour they were exactly what they had come to be, the city's new power couple, ascending, photographed, envied. Claire felt for the first time in years that she had arrived somewhere. Men shook Trevor's hand and let their eyes travel approvingly to her. A society columnist asked her name and spelled it back to her correctly. The chandeliers threw light across a sea of people who mattered, and she stood in the middle of it and let herself believe she had finally chosen right. Then something changed in the room. It started near the entrance and moved inward like a current, a turning of heads, a dropping of conversations mid-sentence, a strange and electric hush that spread table by table. Claire felt it before she understood it. People were rising to their feet. Not a few people. Hundreds of them, the most powerful figures in 3 states, standing the way a congregation stands. A man had entered in a black suit that fit him like armor worn into battle. He moved without hurry, without any visible awareness of the silence collapsing around him, and the chairman of the largest bank on the floor, a man who had kept senators waiting, crossed the room personally to meet him and shook his hand with both of his own. Claire's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. She knew the walk before she let herself know the face. She knew the set of the shoulders, the stillness, the way the man carried quiet through a loud room like a stone carries weight through water. The wine in her glass trembled. It was Julian. A microphone had appeared at the front of the room, and the gala's host was saying something Claire could not hear over the rushing in her own ears. And then Julian stepped to the podium, and the entire hall held its breath as one organism. "For 2 years," Julian said, and his voice filled the room without effort, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "You've been asking who built Black Ridge Holdings, who designed the Mercer architecture, who has been sitting behind the curtain while the rest of you guessed." He let the room wait. "My name is Julian Brooks. I founded Black Ridge Holdings 11 years ago. I am its principal and its majority owner, and the merger that half the people in this room have staked their year on lives or dies by a decision I will make this week." The hall did not erupt. It did something stranger and more total. It went utterly silent, the silence of several hundred powerful people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they knew. Claire could not breathe. Her mind threw images at her faster than she could refuse them. The riddles he spoke in, the phone calls he took in the next room and never explained, the men who had appeared at the apartment over the years, expensive men in expensive coats, who Julian always met outside and sent away before she could ask. And the ring, the heavy signet ring she had found once in the pocket of his work jacket and asked about, and that he had brushed off as an old keepsake, and that she now understood, with a cold, plunging horror, bore the same mark she had seen 1,000 times in the corner of the Black Ridge letterhead in the newspapers. She had been married to the faceless titan. She had washed his work clothes and complained about the smell of motor oil and slid divorce papers across the table at the richest man in the state. Across the room, Trevor Hayes had gone the color of paper. His mind was running a different calculation, and the answer it kept arriving at made his stomach turn. His development fund, the engine of everything he was, the thing that made him visionary instead of merely loud, had been financed 18 months ago through a chain of intermediaries he had been too arrogant to fully trace. The capital had come through a holding company, and that company through another, and the trail had vanished into exactly the kind of fog that surrounded Blackridge. He had built his empire, he now understood, on the patient money of the man whose wife he had taken. The reception became a different thing after that. People who had not noticed Julian an hour before now arranged themselves to be near him, and Julian, who wanted none of it, moved through them with a courtesy that never warmed his eyes, finding Claire across the crowd exactly once. He did not glare, he did not smile. He simply looked at her, the look of a man recognizing someone he used to know, and then he turned back to the chairman of the bank and resumed a conversation worth more than everything Trevor Hayes owned. It was Claire who came to him. She found him near a tall window, momentarily alone, the lights of Chicago spread out below. "You let me believe." Her voice would not hold steady. "All those years. You let me think we were drowning. You let me beg you to want more." "I never lied to you, Claire." Julian's tone was not cruel. That was the part that undid her. There was no cruelty in it at all, only a terrible settled calm. "You asked me to be someone who clawed and grasped and measured his worth in towers. I had already been that man. I knew what it cost." "Cost you what?" she demanded. "What could it possibly have cost you to just tell me the truth?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes, a grief so old it had become part of the architecture of his face. "More than I was ever willing to pay again," he said, and he stepped past her into the crowd. What he did not say, what he had said to no one in 2 years, was the shape of that cost. There had been a woman before Claire Mason's mother, Eleanor, who had loved Julian when he was rising and ruthless and never home, who had been pulled into the machinery of that world until it ground something essential out of her. The men he did business with had treated her as leverage. The pressure had not relented, even when she grew ill, and it had been there at the end, in a hospital corridor, when Julian finally understood that the empire he had built had become a thing that ate the people he loved. He had walked away from all of it the week after the funeral. He had taken his infant son to a small apartment in a working neighborhood and chosen deliberately to raise the boy as the child of a delivery driver, out of sight of the men who measured human beings by their usefulness. He had run Blackridge through proxies and anonymous lines so that no one would ever again be able to reach the people he loved by reaching him. He had married Claire as that man, the plain one, the patient one. He had hoped foolishly that she had wanted that man. He had been wrong, and the wrongness had cost him nothing he had not already braced to lose. In the days after the gala, the structure of Trevor Hayes's world began to fail. It happened the way real collapses happen, not with a single blow, but with a withdrawal of the thing that had been holding everything up. The patient capital that had financed Trevor's development fund came due, and the intermediaries who had been so accommodating grew suddenly immovably formal. Lines of credit that had always renewed did not renew. A bank that had been eager became cautious and then cold. Trevor made call after call and felt the temperature of the entire city drop around him, and somewhere in the middle of it, he understood that he was not being attacked. He was simply being released. The hand that had been quietly holding him aloft for 18 months had opened, and there was nothing beneath him but the distance he had climbed. He confronted Julian once at the Blackridge offices, having talked his way past 2 layers of people who clearly did not want him there. "You're destroying me," Trevor said, "over a woman. You're going to burn down everything I built over a woman who chose me." Julian regarded him from behind a desk that Trevor would have killed to sit at. "I'm not destroying anything, Mr. Hayes. I'm withdrawing my support. There's a difference, though. I understand it doesn't feel like one from where you're standing." He closed the folder in front of him. "You slashed the tires on a delivery van. You leaned on a landlord to put a child out of his home. You did these things to a man you believed had nothing because you enjoyed the certainty that he couldn't answer." Julian's eyes were very steady. "I'm answering. That's all this is." Trevor's fund failed publicly within the week. The reporters who had called him a visionary now called him overextended, then troubled, then finished. He stood in front of cameras on the courthouse steps and tried to project confidence, and projected only a man watching the floor disappear. And Claire, who had tied her own ascent to his, felt the ground go with him. She came to the apartment on Delmore Street on a Thursday evening. The van had new tires now. The eviction notice was long gone. She stood in the doorway of the home she had fled, in a wine-colored gown, dressed now in plain clothes, her face stripped of the certainty she had worn for years. "I made a mistake," she said. "Julian, I made a terrible mistake. We were a family. Mason needs we could be a family again. For him. For Mason." In the next room, the boy had gone still, listening the way he had listened on the night this all began. Julian set down the wrench he had been holding. He looked at the woman in his doorway for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was no anger in it, which was somehow worse than anger. "You didn't leave me when I was poor," he said quietly. "I could have forgiven that. People are afraid of being poor. I understand fear better than you know." His voice did not rise. "You left me the moment you decided I had no value. That's the part I can't undo, Claire. You looked at the man who fixed your son's shoes, and you saw nothing worth keeping. And nothing I am now. None of it changes what you saw then." Her face crumpled. "That's not fair." "No." Julian agreed. "It isn't. Almost nothing about any of this has been fair." He turned back to his work. "The car's still running rough on the left side. You should have it looked at before you drive home." She left in tears. Trevor was finished his name a cautionary tale in the columns that had crowned him. Her own company had begun quietly to distance itself from the woman attached to the season's largest scandal. And in the next room, an 8-year-old boy sat very still on the couch, having heard his mother beg and his father refuse, having understood for the first time and all at once that the warmth he had always taken for granted in that small apartment was something a person could choose to throw away, and that his mother had chosen it. He did not run to her when she left. He did not say goodbye. That more than anything Julian could have done was the thing that broke her heart. The story did not stay in the financial pages for long. It was too good to stay anywhere. A man who drove other people's packages around Cleveland, who patched his son's sneakers with electrical tape, who let a landlord threaten to put him on the street. That same man was the silent owner of Black Ridge Holdings, the one whose unnamed signature had already been called the wealthiest in the state of Ohio. Now the name had a face. The reversal was irresistible. It ran on the morning programs and the evening ones in the papers and across every feed. The photograph of Julian in his black suit at the Sterling Gala, set beside a grainy image someone had dug up of him, loading boxes into a van. The contrast did the work no headline could. The city that had not noticed Julian Brooks now could speak of nothing else. He hated it. That was the truth no one printed. He moved through the noise with a stillness that the cameras read as mystique, and that was, in fact, only a man enduring exactly the thing he had spent years protecting his son from. He gave no interviews. He let the firm's attorneys handle the requests, and he kept driving Mason to school himself through a small crowd of photographers that thinned a little more each morning, until eventually they stopped coming altogether. Claire did not fare as well in the telling. The woman who had left the secret billionaire for a man who collapsed within the month became in the public imagination a kind of cautionary figure. The wife who could not see what was in front of her, who traded gold for paint because the paint was shinier. Her company, which had once valued her, found her name too entangled with the seasoned scandal to keep her near its clients. The distancing was quiet and complete. She had built a life on being associated with rising things, and she learned how quickly that same logic turns when the things begin to fall. But the public verdict was not the wound that mattered to her. The wound that mattered was 8 years old and would not look at her. Mason had grown quiet in a way Julian recognized and feared. The boy still went to school, still played, still ate his cereal with his elbows on the table. But a door had closed somewhere behind his eyes, and Julian found him one evening sitting on the back step that led to the garage, turning his mended sneaker over in his hands, the way Julian himself turned broken things. "Dad," Mason said without looking up, "can I ask you something, and you tell me the true answer?" Julian sat down on the step beside him. "Always. If you were rich the whole time." The boy struggled with it the way he struggled with the questions that were too big for the words he had. "Why did we live like this? Why didn't I get the good shoes? Why did Mom have to think we were poor?" His voice cracked. "Why did you let her leave when you could have just shown her, and she would have stayed?" It was the question Julian had known would come and dreaded and never found a clean answer for, because the clean answer required him to open a room he had kept locked since a hospital corridor 8 years gone. He looked out at the small, dark yard for a while. Then he reached over and took the sneaker gently from his son's hands, the way he had taken it on the night this all began. "Your mother," he said quietly. "Your real mother. Eleanor. I've never told you much about her." Mason went very still. He had only ever heard the name in fragments. "She married me when I was a different man than the one you know. I was building Black Ridge then, and I was good at it better than almost anyone, and I never let myself forget it. I was in every important room. I was never home. And the men I did business with, the kind who measure people by how useful they are when they couldn't reach me, they reached for the things I loved. They used your mother to get to me. They never let her be a person. Just a way in." His thumb moved over the mended sole. "She got sick, and even then they didn't stop, and I sat in a hospital at the end of it, and I understood that I had built something that ate the people I loved alive. So the week after we buried her, I took you were a baby, and I walked away from all of it. The towers, the name, the man who measured everything." Mason was crying now, silently, the way children cry when they understand they are being trusted with something too heavy for them. "I moved us here," Julian went on, "and I ran the company through other people so no one would ever know to come looking for you. The shoes, the apartment, the small life, I didn't give you that, because I had no choice, son. I gave it to you on purpose, because I had already watched what the other life does to the people inside it. I wanted you to grow up knowing what a man is actually worth before anyone ever told you what he's worth on paper." He set the shoe down between them. "And your mother, Claire. I hoped she had married the delivery driver because she wanted him. When she found out she hadn't, she'd already shown me which man she'd been waiting for the whole time. I couldn't have shown her the truth to keep her Mason. The truth was the one thing that would always send her away." For a long moment the boy said nothing. Then he leaned against his father's side, and Julian put an arm around him, and they sat together on the step in the dark, while something in Mason's small frame slowly unclenched. "I'm glad you fixed my shoes," Mason finally said. "So am I," said Julian. What Julian did with the months that followed told the city more about him than any interview could have. He started a fund in Eleanor's name, a scholarship for the children of working families, the kind of families who lived on streets like Delmore, whose children walked to bus stops with split soles and learned early what other children thought of them for it. He did not put his own name on it. He put hers. The first checks went out before most people even knew the fund existed. Then he bought the block. He bought the building he had nearly been evicted from and the 3 buildings around it, and he did not raise a single rent. Walter Pruitt, who had taped an eviction notice to a struggling man's door, found himself selling to that same man and retiring on the proceeds, and Julian let him keep his dignity in the deal because Julian had stopped a long time ago needing to win the small ones. The families who lived there, The ones Trevor Hayes would have cleared out for something, Glass and Tall, stayed. Their rent stayed. The neighborhood that had nearly swallowed Julian became quietly the safest place to be poor in the entire city. Trevor Hayes did not recover. A financial review of his fund's collapse turned up the kinds of things such reviews turn up when a man has been more concerned with appearing successful than with being solvent. He was investigated, and the investigation found enough to finish whatever the bankruptcy had left standing. He left the city eventually. The columns that had crowned him forgot him with the same speed they had once celebrated him, which is the only mercy that world reliably offers. Claire tried in the slow and stumbling way of someone who has finally understood the size of a thing too late to find her way back to her son. She did not ask Julian for money. To her credit, and Julian noted it privately. Without softening toward her, she never once asked for money. She asked only for time with Mason, and Julian gave it, because whatever had ended between the two adults, the boy had known her as his mother for nearly all his life, and Julian would not be the man who took her from him out of spite. He had watched what spite did to families. He had buried the proof of it. But the thing between Claire and Mason did not mend the way she needed it to. The boy was polite with her. He was even sometimes kind. But the unguarded trust that had once flowed toward her without thought was gone, and it did not come back, because trust like that is not a thing a person can rebuild on a schedule. He had heard her call his father someone who would never be anybody. He had watched her walk out to a black car without looking back at the window where he stood. Children forgive a great deal. They do not forget being shown exactly where they rank. Claire learned to live inside that. It was perhaps the truest education she had received in years, that some things once lost, you do not get back, no matter how the ledger of your life is later corrected. A year passed. By then, Julian Brooks had become a different kind of public figure than the headlines had first made him. Not the secret billionaire, not the man who had been thrown away and vindicated, but something steadier and harder to package. People told his story to each other as a lesson, though they did not always agree on what the lesson was. He let them. He had stopped long before caring what a room full of strangers decided he meant. He still drove Mason to school every morning. He could have hired a car and a driver and a security detail. The firm's people had begged him to. He drove the boy himself in a car that was nice now, but not showy, and he walked him to the doors, and the photographers were long gone, and it was just a father and a son, and the ordinary gray light of Cleveland in the morning. On a Saturday in the spring, Julian stood at the edge of a blacktop court behind Mason's school, watching the boy play basketball with a knot of other children. Mason had grown an inch over the winter. He laughed more easily now than he had in the dark months after the gala. His shoes were good ones, but Julian had noticed that the boy still kept the old mended pair in his closet and would not let them be thrown away. And Julian had decided not to ask him why, because he thought he already knew. Another parent drifted over to stand beside him at the fence, a man Julian did not know watching his own kid out on the court. He glanced sideways, taking in the unremarkable jacket the quiet bearing, and something clicked. "Hey," the man said, half disbelieving. "Aren't you? You're him, aren't you? The Blackridge guy. The billionaire." He gave a short laugh. "What are you doing standing at a grade school basketball game? You're really that guy." Julian watched his son sink a shot and turn, grinning to find his father's eyes in the small crowd, checking the way children check, that the one person who matters is still there and still watching. Julian raised a hand to the boy. Then he turned back to the stranger, and a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "No," Julian said. "I'm just a father trying to do right by his son." The man started to say something else, but Julian had already turned back to the court, his whole attention given over to the boy in the good shoes, who had once worn taped-up ones, and after a moment, the stranger let it go. Out on the blacktop, Mason called something to his father and pointed at the hoop, promising another shot. And Julian nodded and called back that he was watching that he was always watching, and the morning light came down soft over the court and the fence, and the man who had once been named the richest in the state, and wanted in the end only to be exactly where he was. The strongest man is not the richest one. He is the one who keeps a tender heart after losing everything.